In the public mind, when most think of the Cold War, they picture a foggy bridge in Berlin or nuclear-tipped missiles pointing east to west and vice versa. This public perception, however, does a disservice to the many other battlefields where the Cold War played out. One of those early conflicts took place in the southeast corner of Europe over territory that had actually been fought over for thousands of years. I'm your host David, and today we'll be talking about Turkey, a country which had remained neutral through the Second World War, but was quickly drawn into the Byzantine international politics of the post-war era. This is the Cold War. In 1938, Turkey lost the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Despite the man's death, the transition of power went smoothly, with no great shifts in the secular domestic policies and careful foreign policies that had been set by Ataturk. The presidency fell to İsmet İnönü, a close associate of Ataturk, but a war hero in his own right, and he continued the rapid modernization process that was being brought to the largely agrarian society. İnönü's goal at the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe was to maintain Turkish neutrality, and to this end, he signed a treaty of mutual assistance with Britain and France in October of 1939. He then went on to sign the non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany in June of 1941, just days before the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Although Turkey was pressured to join in the war effort by both the Axis and the Allies for the remainder of the war, Turkey maintained its neutrality until February of 1945, when it finally joined the Allied nations in declaring war against Germany. Conveniently, joining the war against the Axis qualified Turkey for founding membership status in the new United Nations. In March 1945, Stalin revoked a 1925 non-aggression treaty between the two countries, and in the late summer of 1946, demanded a revision of the 1936 Montreux Convention, which had given Turkey full control over the Turkish Straits. Stalin was seeking joint control over the Straits, as well as a permanent military presence there. The Montreux Convention limited warship access to the Straits, meaning that while the Black Sea was Soviet-dominated, it also restricted Soviet access to the Mediterranean. As the Soviet Union increased troop concentrations near the Turkish border, as well as conducted increasingly aggressive naval maneuvers in the Black Sea, Turkey reached out to the Western Allies seeking support. The United States responded by dispatching a naval task force to the region and publicly made it clear that it was willing to resist Soviet intervention in Turkey. By the end of October, the Soviet Union recognized that its involvement in Turkey could provoke an outbreak of a new war, and withdrew not only its request for a review of the Montreux Convention, but also the bulk of the combat forces it had moved into the region. An early face-off between the two superpowers had just been won by the United States. So, Turkey up to this point had been a firmly one-party state, controlled by the Kemalist CHP, the party founded by Ataturk. However, with the 1945 approval of the UN Charter, 4 members of the CHP party called for the application of the liberties enshrined in the Charter, as well as the democratization of political life in Turkey. The 4 deputies included the former Prime Minister, Jalal Bayar, as well as future Prime Minister Adnan Menderes. Their proposal, however, was rejected, resulting in the 4 resigning from the CHP to form a new party, the Democratic Party. Despite his initial rejection to the call for democratization, İnönü quickly realized the new situation he was in and gave his blessing to the establishment of the new party, making sure to ensure that the DP would not be against the secular nature of the Turkish Republic. The first ever multi-party elections were held in Turkey in 1946, although it should be noted that there were claims of ballot falsification. The DP only won 62 seats out of the total 465 available, but even with this small minority, it became an outspoken opponent to the CHP. While the DP was largely seen as representing the interests of private business and industry, it also received strong support in more rural areas of the country. Ultimately, both the CHP and the DP were pro-Western in nature, and both advocated integrating Turkey further into the Western world. This stance was supported by both Great Britain and the United States, naturally, who saw Turkey not only as a potential active participant in the Western alliance, but as a vital bulwark against Soviet ambitions in a key geopolitical region. Okay, so we know that Turkey was looking for self-security on the geopolitical stage. What they were also looking for, however, was financial assistance. The Turkish budget found itself under severe strain at the end of the war. I know, I can hear you saying it now, but David, Turkey didn't fight in the war until the very end. Which is true, but what can often be overlooked is that Turkey needed to maintain a very large standing army to ward off the threat of both Nazi and Soviet invasion. The Turkish economy was also hurting due to the loss of several trading partners at the end of the war. So Turkey was eyeing the funds being offered up by the Marshall Plan. However, those funds had been prioritized for countries that had been devastated by the war. Turkey, knowing that it did not have overwhelming support in the United States to advocate for its inclusion on the list of recipient nations, began to use the specter of the Soviet Union as leverage. In exchange for receiving Marshall Plan assistance, Turkey would bring itself west into the Allied sphere of influence. In the summer of 1947, guided by the emerging Truman Doctrine and its mission to prevent the spread of Soviet geopolitical influence, Turkey was granted $100 million to help fund the continued maintenance of its standing army. Incidentally, the sum received was likely only as large as it was because of the ongoing Greek Civil War. Washington's clear priority was keeping the communists from winning in Greece, but in order not to offend either the Greeks or the Turks, which I'm sure you're aware have some history of slight enmity, funding to each was supplied in equal amounts. By 1952, as the Marshall Plan was being wrapped up, Turkey had received up to $350 million in American aid. Harry Truman, in a message to the American people, had referred to Turkey as one of the best examples of American aid, claiming that Turkey was an example of a country where a relatively small investment in agriculture had simply justified itself. So what did this success actually look like? The most obvious impact by 1952 was that the domestic investment in Turkey had skyrocketed, with estimates of investment being 3 to 4 times more than the Marshall Plan aid itself. The US money had allowed for Turkey to invest in itself. This is a huge win, right? Well, yes, but with a but. The Turkish economy, still heavily agrarian, had grown so quickly that it was struggling to find buyers for its surplus. Not the worst problem to have, but still a problem. Despite that, the 4 years of Marshall Plan aid had allowed for a breakthrough in the Turkish economy. The standard of living for a majority of the population had increased, and the economy itself was no longer seen as stagnating under the burden of heavy military expenditures. Okay, so Turkey's starting to tie itself into the Western countries, but I can hear you asking what impact did this West-leaning policy have on Turkey's geopolitical stance? Well, I'm glad you're asking that, as it brings this channel to a topic that we've not really touched on yet, but will soon become a recurring item: NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been created in 1949 as a defensive alliance to stand against the threat of Soviet aggression. It was made up of 10 Western European nations, plus the United States and Canada. For its part, Turkey had applied for membership, but was initially ignored. However, the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 gave Turkey an opportunity. It became the second nation, after the United States, to respond to the United Nations call to action and send troops to Korea. Up to 15,000 troops saw service there, and more than 700 lost their lives. At a NATO Council of Ministers meeting in September 1951, both Greece and Turkey were accepted to NATO membership, with Turkish membership taking effect on February 18, 1952. US air and missile bases were established at Izmir and Adana. I want you to keep those names in mind for when this channel gets to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as they become rather important. In addition to its acceptance into NATO, in 1954 Turkey concluded the Balkan Pact with Yugoslavia and Greece, a defensive military pact between the three nations. Turkey then went on to play a central role in the creation of the Baghdad Pact, renamed Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO, in 1959. CENTO was another defensive pact, this time between the United Kingdom, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. These alliances were designed with protection from Soviet aggression in mind, clearly and firmly placing Turkey in the Western orbit. This pro-Western stance even went so far as Turkish recognition of the State of Israel, which had a negative impact on Turkish prestige in the Arab world. Okay, so to summarize where we are, Turkey, a fledgling two-party democracy by the early 1950s, had aligned itself with the Western powers to help protect its sovereignty from Soviet expansionism, but also to help boost its economy by means of accepting aid from the United States. However, by the late 1950s, in the last period of the Menderes government, Western credit was beginning to evaporate. Turkey began to consider its alternatives, including assistance from the Soviet Union, and an official visit to Moscow by Menderes was planned for 1960. To make sense of all this, as well as what is to come, we now need to look at domestic political situation in Turkey in the 1950s. Elections held in 1950 saw 408 seats won by the DP, compared to only 69 secured by the CHP. For the first time in Turkish history, the CHP had lost power. Bayar, the former prime minister, became the president while Menderes became PM. As was expected, Menderes began introducing economic policies that would reduce reliance on the state and would instead encourage private enterprise as well as foreign investment in industrial development. On the social side, the new DP government made the controversial decision to revoke the ban on the Arab language Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer. This had been banned in 1938, forcing mosques to perform Adhan in Turkish. The revocation created concern over the Islamic orientation of the DP, especially among the staunchly secular military. Elections held in 1954 resulted in the DP increasing its majority in parliament, and they went on to introduce a number of sweeping changes, including reforming the civil service as well as state-run enterprises. However, the opposition CHP declared these changes to be both undemocratic and authoritarian. Menderes, undeterred, continued with seemingly more and more repressive policies, leading to a loss in popularity. This loss resulted in the CHP gaining 147 seats in the 1957 elections, a dramatic increase, but still leaving them as the opposition. Tension across the country continued to increase and even saw outbreaks of violence and bloodshed in early 1960 as the CHP leader Inonu toured the country and police were used to break up student protests. The Menderes government responded by suspending all political activity and imposing martial law. The stage was now set for the first, but certainly not the last, Turkish military coup. We here at The Cold War will continue to discuss this in future videos, so please make sure you subscribe to our channel and to press the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thecoldwartv. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and we will catch you on the next one.